He was my senior, a much envied senior, I should say, and a great guy, a great musician, singer, preacher, and teacher as well. So over to Francis to take us through a, a really quick overview of Christ in the Old Testament. So, Francis, thank you so much for joining us once again, and over to you now.
Thank you. Okay, let me share the screen first. Okay, a very good evening to all of you. Once again, I really want to thank Sam and the entire church for having me over for the session. Um, Let me begin with a story. And this is a story um, uh, that I was actually that happened back in 2011. And this was the time when I was with a mission organization called Youth with a Mission. And I was part of a training program called the School of Biblical Studies, where we actually studied the Bible inductively um, for over 9 months. And so we had finished with the New Testament, and then we were getting into the Old Testament books. And during the New Testament, all of the students were so excited because when you encounter the gospel, you meet Jesus and you see his birth and his life and ministry, and you're so excited by getting to see the God incarnate in flesh, through the books of, through the gospel stories. And so everybody was excited. But when we went to the Old Testament and we began to study the books, initially the students were excited because you come across creation and fall and then the stories of the call of, the patriarchs and then Israel. So initially the students were excited. But as we kept on studying some of the books, as uh, we begin to encounter violence and a lot of things that probably we might not understand. And you know uh, soon in those stories, and in the midst of reading those books, a question emerged among some of us, and that was, where is Jesus in the Old Testament? I miss the Jesus of the New Testament, where he is going about and doing things, but I don't see Jesus in the Old Testament. And this is where I hope some of us are also, having read the Old Testament, we're wondering, when do we get to actually see Jesus, other than in the New Testament, but also in the Old Testament? Um, I do want to say that this question, although is genuine, um, I do have a bit of hesitation with this question as well, and I'll hopefully address that in the session as well. But there, but then, as we begin the session, there are two ways to look at this inquiry. There are two ways to answer this question. Um, so we have the Old Testament and the New Testament. One way is to, having read the New Testament and through the Gospels, having encountered Jesus, you read back into the Old Testament. So, for example, so that's where you revisit the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament. So in the light of having encountered Jesus in the New Testament, you go back to the Old Testament and sort of revisit and make sense of some of the things, that are there in the Old Testament. The other approach is where you read the Old Testament and then you sort of like anticipate uh, Jesus through the books of the Old Testament and then step into the New Testament. So there are these two ways where you can actually approach this inquiry. And so we look at both this evening with the limited time that we have. So in the revisiting approach, so for example, we've read this scripture where Paul writes to the Colossian church, and this is the opening of what most scholars would call a hymn, a very ancient hymn, and it's a hymn about Jesus. So he goes on to say, he is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. So we encounter, so the hymn writer, or Paul to say precisely, you know, writes this hymn. So having read this, if we come back to Genesis 1 and 2, we have the story of the creation account. And if you've ever read the Old Testament, you would never would have thought that Jesus is there in the creation with God the Father and Holy Spirit as he is bringing things into life. And but having read the Colossian hymn, having read Paul's hymn, when you read Genesis 1 and 1, you see that Jesus was with God the Father and the Holy Spirit in the very first acts of God in creation. And that's actually incredible. So this is what a revisiting approach is. Another example would be, we are all familiar with what Jesus had accomplished on the cross, his victory over sin and death, and the freedom and the redemption that he brought through by his work, by his finished act on the cross. And so we read in Colossians again, chapter 2, verses 15. And having disarmed the powers and authorities, he made a public spectacle of them, triumphing over them by the cross. And so, having read this passage and having understood the theology of the atonement of sin that Jesus accomplishes on the cross, and having understood this in the New Testament, when you read Genesis chapter 3, verses 15, often people and scholars and the early church fathers, especially, they've seen that what we see in Genesis 3:15 of the struggle between the seed of the woman and of the serpent. Many people have said that that's the first gospel, or the proto gospel, as people would call it. That's the first good news that we hear of in the story after the sin and fall of mankind. In the midst of the judgment that God pronounces on the very first couple, here's a glimpse of the good news that we see uh, in Genesis. And so people would often say, yeah, there we see Jesus in the Old Testament. That's the very first promise of the seed of the woman coming down to crush the head of the serpent, or to say uh, sin and all that it entails. So 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 this is the revisiting approach, and this is not something new. This is the kind of reading that the disciples of Jesus, or the early New Testament writers, and the early church actually adopted. They would often revisit the Old Testament or reinterpret some of the Old Testament texts in the light of the Jesus event. And thus they would see Jesus in every book of the Old Testament, or in some of the dominant characters in the Old Testament, or in some of the significant events in the Old Testament. And so we would take a look at what this would mean for us. One of the dominant uh, um, way of seeing Jesus in the Old Testament in this revisiting approach is to encounter some of the events in the Bible, or I would say appearances of God uh, in the Old Testament text as Christ Himself. And so this is called um, Christophany in the Old Testament. Now, this we all know what a theophany is. Theophany is a visual manifestation of God to human beings. And so Christophany is a visual manifestation of Jesus to human beings. And this is a particular kind of pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus. So in the early church and among the early church fathers as well, uh, so they would see that the only uh, uh, that it's the second person in the triune God that actually comes to the earth on behalf of God. And so that they saw it in the incarnate Jesus, and so they pushed it back to a lot of the uh, divine appearances in the Old Testament as Jesus actually, uh, as and saying that was actually Jesus. So a couple of them would be, the very first instance that we see is in the case of an angel of the Lord who actually visits Hagar twice. One, she is, um, she's when she's carrying Ishmael, and then after, having given birth to Ishmael in chapter 21, as well as she's running away from Sarah and Abraham The angel of the Lord visits her and comforts her and promises to her. So this particular uh, emphasis where it's the angel of the Lord that appears in several instances in the Bible, often there's confusion actually as to whether it's a divine messenger, in a sense, a heavenly being, like an angel sort of thing, or actually the Lord himself, that is Jesus himself. Because often there, you can't be clearly, when you're reading these chapters, it's sort of like one overlaps the other. At times you feel like it's the angel of the Lord, and at times it's the Lord himself that's speaking. So you see those sort of instances. You also see when Abraham is actually sacrificing Isaac, the angel of the Lord appears and stops Abraham from killing his own son. We have the appearance of, again, the angel of the Lord in the burning bush and speaking to Moses. And again, it's very difficult to make sense whether it's actually the angel of the Lord or the Lord himself in and through the text as you're reading it, because it sort of goes back and forth. Uh, and then another famous one that we know of is from 2 Kings chapter 19, verses 35, that in response to Hezekiah's prayer, the angel of the Lord actually strikes down, 185, 100 Assyrians. And so you have that particular manifestation as well. Going on to in Joshua chapter 5, we have the commander of the army of the Lord coming in. And so often scholars and the early church fathers have also said, oh, that was Jesus actually appearing to Joshua. Then you have the famous fourth person in the burning furnace in Daniel chapter 3, um, which is also, scholars have often said, that was actually Jesus himself who appears in the burning furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And so, you know, there are several of these appearances that are recorded in the Old Testament that is actually divine. And so, scholars have looked back on these texts and in the light of the New Testament and of Jesus's coming in the flesh, they've often said that, okay, this is a pre-incarnate appearance of Jesus in the Old Testament. But again, not everybody agrees with every single instance. Some of these appearances are quite disputed in biblical scholarship, whether it was actually really Jesus or whether it was simply one of the heavenly beings, like an angel. Um, so, yeah, that's Christophany in the Old Testament that we see. And I'm sure while you were reading and through the Old Testament, you would have encountered several of these instances as well. Another major um, way in which people have revisited the Old Testament in the light of the New Testament is in seeing characters and events as type of Jesus. Now, again, in this we have to be understanding that a character or an event in the Old Testament is seen as a type of Jesus if it finds its fulfillment in Jesus. So, in a sense, this character or event has to be linked to the salvation story, and in some sense this character or an event has to be has to find an intensification in what Jesus does in his life and ministry and in his personhood as well. So again, some of the ones that we find in the recorded in the New Testament as well is in John chapter 3 verses 14, in Jesus' talk with Nicodemus. We find this instance that as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, which is actually taken from Numbers, you find it in Numbers chapter 21 verse 9, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. When Moses lifted up the bronze serpent, it sort of stopped the plague. And in similar way, Jesus sort of speaks to Nicodemus and says, in and through his life, this the plague of sin would actually be destroyed in the way he's going to be crucified. So you see that sort of a thing. The other one is the Passover lamb. We see it as a type of Christ in his crucifixion and what that accomplishes. Another instance is also what Paul records in First Corinthians is the rock that Moses struck in the wilderness, to produce water for the people. It actually anticipates Jesus providing spiritual drink from a spiritual rock, and so Jesus being the living waters, that sort of a thing. So, um, And you will find several of these, this sort of, looking back at characters and events and finding its fulfillment in Jesus, especially in the Epistle of Hebrews. Um, uh, and so this is widespread in the New Testament that you find. Further going, there are also some typologies that, deriving from this sort of a methodology, that early church fathers have uh, done. They've often seen Isaac as a type of Jesus. Um, just a simple being. There are several resonances in Isaac's sacrifice and Jesus' sacrifice on the cross as well. And so they've seen these connections between two characters and in what they accomplish, and seeing Jesus as sort of like intensifying that very theme. Uh, and so they've seen uh, the 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 similarities, I would say, in Isaac and Jesus as well. So at a verbal level, you will find that both of them were sacrificed, or Isaac was supposed to be, the altar was built and everything was ready. He was supposed to be sacrificed on a particular mountain. So does Jesus. He was actually going, Isaac was going to be sacrificed. And in Judaism, actually, they attribute, the merit of the fathers coming to the descendant. And so in Isaac's willingness to be sacrificed, not just Abraham, but in Isaac's willingness to be sacrificed, you see that the merit of the the faith of the patriarch being coming down to the descendants. Similarly, Jesus's death and what it accomplishes, it's a vicarious death. It's a substitutionary death that takes away the sin of the entire humankind. So we see an intensification in Jesus's vicarious death. Now coming to Boaz, Boaz in what he does, in the way he redeems Ruth. Uh, we see him as a kinsman redeemer in the book of Ruth. And so similarly, we see that there are several connections between Boaz and Jesus that's established as well. In that sense, Boaz only redeems Ruth, and then because of that, you see the Davidic line being established. But in Jesus, you see the redemption of all humankind. The whole creation is actually redeemed in Jesus, and so there is an intensification as well. And so there are these typologies that people have seen, in the Old Testament, and this stems from their reading of the New Testament, and especially the Gospel and the Jesus that they encounter in the Gospel. Another way to read, so this is the revisiting approach. Another approach is to read the Old Testament just as it is. And this is the anticipating approach, as I would call it. And in doing so, there are two ways in which this is accomplished again. One is you see some of the prophecies in the Old Testament that are unfulfilled, and then you have this sense of anticipation. Okay, who will be the one who would fulfill these prophecies? The prophecies concerning uh, the anointed one, of God, who would come and usher in God's reign and bring back Israel to back its former glories, all sort of prophecies that are there in the Old Testament that you find, so many of them are unfulfilled as you read the Old Testament. And so when you read the Old Testament, you sort of have this anticipation, okay, when are these prophecies going to be fulfilled? And in whom uh, will these prophecies ultimately find its fulfillment? So there is this anticipation inside of us as we read the Old Testament through, book after book, and especially among the prophets. But there are also these patterns that remain unfulfilled. Uh, you know, I need to actually find a better word for this, and forgive me for that. But as of now, let's call it this. That there are unfulfilled patterns that we see in the Old Testament that sort of creates an anticipation in the readers as to who would fulfill both the prophecies and the patterns as well. And so let's take a quick look at that. So coming to unfulfilled prophecies, actually, one of the prominent Old Testament scholar, Walter Kaiser, he says that there are about 39 explicit predictions in the Old Testament prophets that exclusively point to the coming Messiah and are fulfilled in Jesus alone. And so some of these are quite familiar to all of us. So I'll quickly, rush through them. We have the prophecies that the coming Messiah would be one who is born of a virgin, uh, you know, and then we have that he will be born in Bethlehem. Going on, before his birth, he will also have a forerunner that is predicted both in Isaiah and Malachi, and you see that being fulfilled in John the Baptist. Uh, then you have the famous, kingdom charter in Isaiah chapter 61, which is also read by Jesus in Luke chapter 4. That the coming Messiah will be one who will usher in the good news to the poor and the brokenhearted and the captives. He will set the prisoners free. And so there is that liberation charter, as some would call it. We find that in Isaiah 61, and that is something that the coming Messiah would accomplish. And then you have his triumphal entry into Jerusalem being recorded in some of the Old Testament texts. Uh, and that people would cry out Hosanna, that being written specifically over there. And then you have about his sufferings, where the coming Messiah would be betrayed and tortured and killed for the sins of the world. And especially not just Isaiah 53, but the four servant songs that we find in Isaiah all point um, to the fact that the coming Messiah would be tortured, would be killed for the sins of the world. But that is not the end. There is also the promises that he will return again to rule as the King of Kings over all of his creation, and that so there are these prophecies that we find in the Old Testament, which actually, if you haven't read the New Testament, and you've just read the Old Testament, it sort of creates a curiosity in us as to who would be the one who would actually fulfill this, who would be this coming Messiah, who would be the anointed one of God, who would fulfill all of these prophecies. And this is the thought that the the Jews who were living in exile after they had returned from Babylon had in mind. Because here they are back in their land. Yes, they've rebuilt the walls, and yes, they've rebuilt the temple, but there is no more king on the throne, as you would imagine. And so they're looking forward to God and the prophecies, and thinking, when would God fulfill his prophecies, and when would he send his anointed one to usher uh, all the former glories for Israel. And so there is this anticipation that you see in all of the prophecies that are there. And time again, as you come after having read all of these prophecies, and when you read the New Testament and the gospel stories, you have the gospel writers actually pointing the readers back again to the Old Testament and showing that how Jesus fulfills all of these prophecies, every one of them, down to its smallest word that is there in the prophecies. So Jesus fulfills all of these prophecies that he find. Another aspect that I would like to draw our attention to is uh, something that I call the unfulfilled patterns, and this is something that sort of excites me. Now I'll explain what that is. So we know the first Adam, in fact, the first couple, when God created mankind, we find it in Genesis chapter 1, verses 26. He created them in his own image, male and female, he created them. And God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, and fill the earth, and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so God actually gives this commission to the very first Adam to steward and to take care of God's good creation. And the same thing we find it in Genesis chapter 2 as well. That as God took the man and he put him in the Garden of Eden, he asked of him to work it and to keep it. And so here we find the very first mandate that God has on the very first humankind. But unfortunately, because of sin, we find that mankind doesn't live up to that very calling that God had placed on on him. And so going, and then from continuing on, we see violence upon violence, sin multiplying itself. And as you read this, and then you have you know everything falling, like spiraling down at the Tower of Babel in Genesis chapter 11. And then finally you have a glimpse of hope in the calling of Abraham the patriarch. And then in and through Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, we have the calling of Israel, um, to be the nation that God desired of it to be, to be an exemplary nation, so that when Israel would live uh, in accordance and in obedience to the covenant that they had entered in with God, the nations would look around. And that's what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 4, when Moses commands obedience from Israel to the very covenant that they have entered into. He says, chapter 4, verses 1 onwards, "And now, Israel, listen to the statutes and the rules that I am teaching you, and do them, that you may live and go in and take possession of the land that the Lord, the God your father, is giving you. You shall not add to the word that I command you, nor take from it, that you may keep the commandments of the Lord your God that I command you. Your eyes have seen what the Lord did at Peor, and it goes on and on. And the challenge is that they would keep the commands of the Lord. And so in verse 6, keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who when they hear all these statutes will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. For what great nation is there that has a God so near to it as the Lord our God is to us whenever we call upon him?" So in and through Israel's obedience to the covenant and obedience to the law, they were supposed to be God's light to the nations. But we know that the very first Adam failed, and so did Israel fail in their calling as well. And so there is this sort of an expectation as to who will be the perfect Adam. When will mankind be all that God wanted it to be? And when will Israel be all that God uh, desired of it to be as a nation, to be a light to the nations around it? And so there is this anticipation that sets in the readers when we read the Old Testament, that when will Adam be perfect, or when will Israel be perfect and be all that God desired of it to be? And so there is this anticipation. And so these that is unfulfilled in the Old Testament, and so we find its fulfillment only in Jesus as we come to the pages of the New Testament. And then going on to the priesthood. When the priesthood was established in Exodus and in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy that we read, they were set apart, and they were called to live in holiness, teaching the laws of the Lord to the people of Israel, and they had specific duties around, in and around the tabernacle, and in the worship service of the Old Testament, if I were to put. And so there is this anticipation as Israel's history goes on, where the priesthood ends up to be very corrupt before the exile, and even after return from the exile. You read it in Malachi, as a prophet calls out the very shepherds of Israel, saying that they have failed, and so there is this anticipation that who will be the perfect high priest, one that mediates between God and his people, um, blamelessly, perfectly. And so there is this anticipation that rises in the priesthood as well, and in the office of the priesthood, that there is no high priest that actually fulfills it uh, perfectly. And so there is this anticipation, longingness in the readers as to who will be the perfect high priest. Again, uh, again, moving on, the office of the prophet as well. You know, uh, when Moses, he speaks in Deuteronomy chapter 18. He as he's reminding Israel at the plains of Moab to be obedient to God and to keep His covenant and everything. He goes on to read. He goes on to say this: "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." And so uh, it sets sort of like an expectation in us that there God will raise a prophet like Moses, one who will speak God ordained words to his people and will command obedience from people to God. And and so that's been and so as you read the Old Testament and as you encounter several prophets in the Old Testament, there is this, you keep on thinking, is Elijah a prophet like Moses? Is Elisha a prophet like Moses? Or some of the prophets who've actually written prophecies in the Old Testament, are they a prophet like Moses? And you see that all of them, even though they fulfill the task that God has entrusted them, they all fall short. And it's only Jesus who actually comes and fulfills, and in the way that he calls out the sins of the people, and as he calls people back into obedience to God, you see that only he is the one who actually fulfills that uh, um, office of a prophet as well, that the Old Testament sets up. And so there is that anticipation that arises in us as well. And then going on, the very office of the king. And so we see, when we read Second Kings, uh, sorry, Second Samuel, chapter 7. Here is God speaking to David through Nathan. And so this is the time where David is the king of Israel, and he's established himself as a king of Israel by defeating all the enemies, and there is rest in Israel. And he's brought the ark back into Jerusalem, and he asks of God, saying that, God, I want to build a house for you. And this is where Nathan comes to David with the word of the Lord, and he says to him, no, you shall not build a house, but your son will. But it's interesting, if you read from verse 12 onwards, there is this anticipation that this throne is going to be an eternal throne. This kingdom would be an eternal throne, and the one who would be seated on the throne would be an eternal king, and it would stem from the line of David as well. And so you read in verse 12, where, as Nathan speaks to David, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I'll raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. And so you see, in some ways, Solomon actually uh, fulfills this sort of demand of God, in that he does build the temple, and and then from there on, although the kingdom splits, but there is always a Davidic king on the throne over Israel. And so you see that. Uh, but then you see, after the exile, and the last that we hear of the line of the David, on the at least in some sort of a rulership, is Zerubbabel. And he's appointed as a governor by the Persian king. But after that, when you look through, especially the Second Temple period, there is no king, there is no ruler from the Davidic line on the throne. And so that sort of sets an anticipation in us as well, a longingness in us as to who would be the true eternal king, who would actually establish the house of God, the people of God, and and usher in the kingdom of God on the earth. And so as you read the Old Testament, these sort of unfulfilled patterns, or should I say motives, are there, which sort of doesn't get fulfilled in the Old Testament. And it sort of sets a longingness in us as readers as to who would be the perfect Adam, who would be the perfect Israel, who would be the perfect high priest, who would be the perfect prophet, who would be the perfect king, who would usher in God's kingdom on the earth. So these are the two dominant approaches, as I've said. One is the revisiting approach, where you have read the New Testament and then you go back into the Old Testament and see how certain characters and events, and divine appearances sort of uh, show us that was actually Jesus, or you see some characters and events as pointing towards Jesus, as a type of Jesus, and you find in Jesus the ultimate fulfillment. Secondly, as you take up the anticipating approach, that you read the Old Testament in and itself, and as you encounter certain prophecies, and as you encounter certain uh, uh, patterns, you see that those are unfulfilled, and then that sort of sets in a longingness in us, that as to who would fulfill these prophecies, who would fulfill these patterns, or these molds, if I were to say, of the perfect Adam, of the perfect Israel, of the perfect high priest, of the perfect prophet, and of the perfect king. So, in conclusion, you finished your journey through the Old Testament, and I hope as you're getting into the New Testament that you would recall some of these, from your readings, and there would be this burning sensation inside of you as you encounter Jesus in the New Testament. Alternatively, as you get into the New Testament, I hope you would also journey back into the Old Testament to see how it all spoke about Jesus and points to him, and that you would be truly in awe of Jesus, both in the Old Testament and in the New Testament as well. So that is it from me. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Francis. It was an extremely interesting thing to learn about Christ in the Old Testament. Personally, I found it very, very interesting. Christ to know through Christophany's types as well as explicit prophecies. Thank you so much. I want to spend a few minutes on some very important announcements. Right. So first, before moving to another surprise thing which is waiting for you all. So the first announcement I want to say is we've been having regular, 20 minutes devotion time every day. That's what we have been having it